But the thing that's gotten my colleagues from across the table, if you will, metaphorically anyway, we often sit beside each other, ecologists and geneticists, going about this is the suggestion, which I think should have been implicit in Sewell Wright's work on the adaptive landscape in the 30s, but they weren't thinking about it right. And again, it sort of begs a natural historical, simple-minded, if you will, looking at the natural world to understand how species are structured genetically in nature. And I remember one of the early times that this was occurring to me was I was giving a talk at the Santa Fe Institute about this kind of stuff. And I had been bird watching there, and I was surprised to see on the grounds American robins. And at first I thought, oh, it's robins, you know. And I thought, hey, robins, that's pretty cool, because as a kid I thought that robins were suburban lawn birds, you know. But then I got to know them in the Adirondacks, deep in the woods. They're like varied thrushes in the Pacific Northwest. The American robin gets way deep into the wet woods in the Adirondacks in the summertime. So I'm used to seeing them up there under those circumstances. Now I'm at 6,000 feet. With a bunch of unfamiliar cacti and so forth around. The only water that's obvious is leaking out of a gardener's hose down beside the building. It's a completely different environment. You stop to think. Local populations of robins there probably have different parasites living on them. They have different food sources, absolutely different food sources. To a great degree, they have different predators acting on them. They have different temperature regimes, they have different water availability, and on and on and on and on. And then you start to realize that any species that has any kind of non-trivial distribution whatsoever are busted up into local populations, integrated into local ecosystems, all of which are differing in their conditions of existence for a focal species, from this place here to that place there, to this place there, to that place there. I started thinking about that and getting everybody to think about this in genetics and ecological terms out at, and I don't want to suggest this is all from me, but this is something I have been thinking about. And it turns out that structure of the geographic structure of the genetics of species is basically probably the most important aspect about creating this stability, because I just sort of rhetorically, you ask yourself, what kind of thing, what kind of a vector, what kind of was it global temperature change or what, is going to take that heterogeneous array of genetic information integrated in these local populations where, after all, the locus of natural selection is, what's going to take that array and just march that whole melange with different, genetically structured rather differently with different distributions and different, to some extent, even different genes in these populations, and march them all in one direction for any great length of time. It almost defies credulity. It's very difficult to do that as a thought experiment. I'd like to see it simulated. We have one of our guys is a simulator. Basically, it's going to probably do this. 9 times out of 10, 99 times out of 100. And I think that that's what the group is going to conclude from all of these different perspectives, that stasis is basically built into the way that genetics is partitioned within species just living in the natural world as a matter of course. Okay. If species are very stable through time, the next, and these are additive, these diagrams here, pattern is, yeah, well, evolution does happen, but it tends to happen when you rather suddenly, and usually in conjunction with what we call a speciation event, which is not too well depicted here for various reasons. The old original punctuated equilibria diagrams, let me show you. I mean, that was my original baby that I was working on, trilobite from the Devonian. Anyway, you can see these arrows here. When you do get the rare events of change, they tend to conform very nicely with what Meyer and Dobzhansky were writing about, but paleontologists really knew nothing about in terms of the splitting of lineages and getting speciation events. And the model that we came up with, I'll just mention it in passing, but I think we have to dust this off and maybe apply it to what I'm really excited about now, which is the third pattern there, is that why would you get sort of what I call economic adaptive change, a change in the adaptations of the organisms having to do with the way they're making a living, the sort of the normal kinds of changes you get in evolution. Why would that be correlated with reproductive changes, which is what you're minimally demanding to have when you get a speciation event going? The model we came up then, I want you to just very briefly, I'll mention it because I think we got to think about it as we get to the end of this talk, is that if you look at the distribution range of any species right now, for the most part, in general, the ranges are the edge of the distribution of any species of anything, cacti or whatever they might be, is the habitat that the environment itself becomes suboptimal, so that beyond that is no longer suitable habitat. Now, there are a lot of exceptions to this, but for the most part, this seems to fit the rule pretty well. And Ernst Mayr had this idea that he published in the 50s about peripheral isolates being the sort of the hot spots for the origin of new species. So that if you, so the metaphor that I have right now, and I think a lot more needs to be done, is just basically restating Mayer's thing, that if you lop off a peripheral population that's already just sort of hanging on there, living in an environment which is suboptimal given what the really cushy environment is given for the adaptations of the species in general, and cut that off, isolate it geographically through some environmental event, usually, but not necessarily, provided the requisite genetic variation is there, natural selection could kick in very quickly and redefine, and here's the metaphorical change that I think is interesting, and redefine that suboptimal habitat as now optimal for this new species as a model for getting very rapid change. Because even though I've been harping on stability, when you do get change, it goes like this. I mean, the cichlid fauna, it's a fish, and they're known to be problematic because there's so many species of them in the different lakes in the East African Rift Valley system. But we know now that Lake Victoria was dry, or almost completely dry, 12,000 years ago, which means that the 300 species or so of cichlid fishes, most of them, I mean, they came down, they lived presumably in the tributaries and so forth. Stocks weren't totally extirpated, but the bulk of that 300 species of cichlid fishes evolved in the last 12,000 years. It almost has to be. There's no other way to really explain it. That's astonishingly fast, but I like it. So it's a tremendous amount of stability, punctuated, if you will, by very, very rapid change when the opportunity comes. Now, let me just go on to the next. Instead of going to that third pattern, that's not going to focus itself, is it? It's a sort of a weird slide. It's a very busy slide, and unlike, there will be no quiz on this one. It's not even possible to read it. But what it says is that every organism basically belongs simultaneously to two hierarchical systems. To make a living, if you're an animal, you need to obtain nutrients and energy supply sources. So you're living with other organisms of your same species in a local population. You're competing with them, or you're cooperating with them, or whatever your relationships are. But you're living and you're forming basically a niche with respect to the other species and the physical environment in a local situation. So organisms are parts of populations which are parts of local ecosystems, and local ecosystems are all interconnected by energy flow and so matter energy flow across them. So basically the whole Earth can be understood, the whole biosphere can be understood as basically one grand ecosystem, which is an integration of all of these regional things, and this is hierarchically structured. On the other hand, organisms are all born through some reproductive process, and at least potentially will reproduce themselves. And they're parts of what geneticists call demes. They're also populations. They may or may not conform exactly in identity to an ecological population. Very often they don't. But anyway, animals reproduce sexually, so you have to choose your partner from a population. So a deme, and demes are parts of species, and species are the largest collection of organisms of any that share reproductive adaptations. Let's define them that way. And then species go extinct, but they also give rise to other species, and they form these chains, these evolutionary chains. Then they make genera and families and orders and phyla and so forth. So organisms at any one time are all members of species, but they're also members of ecosystems.